Good evening, everybody. This is the flight deck here, and welcome aboard our flight this evening, which will be taking us from the O'Higgins Skiway at the Chilean Antarctic base in the Antarctic Peninsula to the British Antarctic Survey base Rothera via the Rot Inlet and the Edgeworth Glacier. In just a few moments, we'll bring up a map for you to take a look at as we go through our pre-flight procedures, and that will give you a good indication of what our routing is like this evening as we make our way down from Higgins, the Rot Inlet, and on to Rothera. Our flying time this evening is going to be about 3 hours. We'll be climbing initially to an altitude of approximately 8,000 feet. Once we reach our cruising altitude, we'll get back to you with more details about the itinerary for our flight this evening. Suffice to say, we are expecting almost perfect weather for our flight this evening. The high cloud that we have here at the O'Higgins Skiway is expected to clear, and by the time we get to the Rot Inlet, which is about 40 minutes flying, we expect the skies to be completely clear and the temperature probably falling to the -5 to -10 degrees Celsius range. Also expecting no wind, so this will be, I think, a very good evening for us. But while flying, please ensure that your seat belts are fastened all the time. We are flying over mountainous terrain, and unexpected turbulence can occur at any time. So at this point, we're going to complete our pre-flight checks, and as soon as we have clearance for takeoff, we will be on our way. We'll be back with you. Good evening again, everybody. This is the flight deck once again, and you may have noticed a few moments ago we started to level off as we reached our cruising altitude of 8,000 feet, and we're now in a position where we can tell you a little bit more about our excursion this evening. So the background behind what we're doing came from a request to visit a pair of peaks in the Rot Inlet area known as the Nodwell Peaks, which was something we assumed would be easy to do. We would simply plot a flight plan to that peak and all would be well. What we discovered though when we started to do our research to plan that flight was there was some ambiguity and also clearly some errors in terms of the information in the public domain as to where these peaks were located. So as a result of that, we had to be a little bit creative in terms of finding the Nodwell Peaks in order that we could plan the excursion that had been requested. And what we'll do is we'll just walk you through some of the sources that we used and how we came to locate what we believe to be the Nodwell Peaks, and included a recent helicopter flight to the region that we'll be visiting this evening. So as I mentioned a moment ago, as we started to do our investigations into planning this flight, there were a couple of anomalies that we came across. Firstly, that some of the resources that are in the public domain had ambiguous information concerning the Nodwell Peaks. In particular, the geographical information system that is really considered to be the prime resource for Antarctic geographical information systems, Antarctica as it's called, referenced two completely separate locations for the Nodwell Peaks, and as we looked into them more closely, it was apparent that neither of them could really be the correct location, as the one referenced a snowfield north of an area that's known as the Ferguson Ridge, and the second was referencing a location in a crevasse field at the toe of another outcrop in the area known as the Chipev Nunatak. And some of that information had also propagated itself into Wikipedia. So those were the problems that we encountered, and it was from there that we set out to see what other data we could use to try and figure out which peaks were the Nodwell Peaks. The way things turned out, there were really four resources that we used in order to try and sort out the confusion around where the Nodwell Peaks really are. So the first is a small book that was produced by Jack Nodwell, and importantly what that had was a pair of survey photographs of the peaks, and these were the only photos that we had to work with as part of this activity. And it also gave some good general context around how it was decided to name the peaks in this area with the names that they were given. The next really important resource that we used was Microsoft Flight Simulator, and its ability to take essentially standard satellite imagery and generate that from that 3D representations in what Microsoft will call as sceneries, and that allowed us to make a visit in advance of tonight's flight and essentially survey the whole area and be confident that we were locating what we were looking for. Then Wikipedia, although it did of course have the same error as Antarctica in terms of the Nodwell Peaks, it does have some useful information for us in that it gives good text descriptions of all the major outcrops in this area, along with their latitude and longitude coordinates, and also descriptions of one mountain relative to another. So we did that, used that in order to cross-reference a lot of the data that we had. And then finally, Antarctica. We used it for one of its intended purposes, which was to create a base map that we could use to project our information on and cross-reference one resource with another. So our primary activity was really around looking at the scenery that Microsoft Flight Simulator generated and comparing that with written physical descriptions that we were able to obtain, comparing what we saw in the simulator with the physical location of the various peaks in the area, and also using the photo images that came from the Jack Nodwell book and comparing that to the way that Microsoft Flight Simulator was representing the landscape. And there were various limitations with the data that we had. One in particular was that we really had no knowledge of at what time of the year or what time of day the photographs or the satellite images had been taken. So in terms of things like shadow effects and snow cover, things may indeed look very different even when we were looking at exactly the same piece of landscape. There is also a tendency for Microsoft Flight Simulator to round and flatten mountains. So some of the more jagged terrain that perhaps the photograph suggests may just have been rounded out in the way that it's represented in the Flight Simulator. And then of course the photos themselves were not very good resolution. They were very contrasty as well. So that made it somewhat difficult to really use them as effectively as we might have done if they had been higher quality. And then the last issue was that the satellite image scans that are available for the area are taken from completely different data sets. So that made it somewhat difficult to get a really cohesive view of the landscape of the area within the simulator. So ultimately the key question that one has to answer is, do the photographs match what we see in the rendering in the simulator? And to me the answer to that is yes, they do. It does take a bit of imagination and using some creative thinking to see that, but I do believe there are matches for the two peaks that we identified as Nodwell 1 and Nodwell 2. If you just look at a single rendering in the simulator, it's harder to see that they are matching, but if you've looked at several different renderings from different angles and in different lighting, and you look at the way that the software has squished the mountain, one can start to see that there are patterns in the rendering in the simulator that match the overall features of the photograph. And it's really on that basis that we're standing our ground and saying the two mountains that we identified as Nodwell 1 and Nodwell 2 that you just saw compared the photograph and the rendering are in fact the original Nodwell Peaks. So in spite of some of those limitations, we were able to identify two peaks that to our thinking qualified as being the Nodwell Peaks in terms of things like their physical description in Wikipedia and the cross-referencing that we did also from Wikipedia, where the relative position of one mountain to another is described. As you'll see as we get to that part of the outing this evening, the alignment with the photographs is a little harder to see, but in spite of that, we do think that these probably are the two peaks that were originally named the Nodwell Peaks, and we've given the precise geographical coordinates at the top of the page here. Now then, the last piece of business that we'll attend to before we begin our official fly-through of the Rot Inlet area. So please take a look at the pocket of the seat in front of you, and you'll find there a tablet device onto which we'll be uploading applications through the evening. The first of which is the field guide to mountains and glaciers of the Rot Inlet drainage area. And you'll find that just to be a quick, useful reference as we go through the flight to help you identify the various mountains. The first page after the cover is a view to the north from high altitude, looking up the inlet onto the Edgeworth Glacier, and then the mountains and peaks beyond that, and the interior plateau of the Antarctic Peninsula. And then on the next page there's a reference map, marks most of the mountains within this area. They're the ones with the little flags in green. The blue flags tag the location of the two Nodwell Peaks, and the two red stars are the erroneous positions for the Nodwell Peaks that were given by Antarctica and by Wikipedia. So now just moving on through the photographs in your guidebook. The first two are taken from Elliott Peak, and they're looking eastwards across the Rot Inlet towards the mountains on the far side. The first one is looking more or less due east, the next one more in a northeasterly direction, and you'll see in those that Nodwell is clearly visible, which made Elliott actually a great vantage point from which to start. So then we continued on up the Edgeworth Glacier directly towards Nodwell 1 and landed in the spot that you see in the next photograph. And then from there we continued further up around the south face of the mountain, and then around the back, which was where we touched down, and took the photograph looking southeast across the second summit, and in the distance the ocean. And then the final picture that you see is the approach that we'll be flying later this evening. If the weather remains as good as it is now, we should have no problems in touching down pretty much right on the summit of Nodwell 1, which will give us an excellent view across the terrain that we've just been looking at. So to conclude the little guide, you'll see in the last page we've just roughly sketched out the course that we'll be taking as we do our flyover. So we'll be coming down from the north, and when we get to the Muskeg Gap we'll make a turn through Muskeg Gap directly towards Mount Elliott, and then as we approach the western side of the Rot Inlet we'll make a turn again to the right, and then in order to gain the 3,000 feet or so that we need to get up to in order to clear the mountains further up the glacier, we'll do a a wide climbing circle between the Ferguson Range and where the Bombardier and Dinsmore glaciers come out. And then from there we'll pretty much take a straight line towards the two Nodwell Peaks, fly around the back of them between the second peak and the Dolan Peak, and then make another right-handed circle in order to line ourselves up for the approach to land on the summit. So with that, we'll just get back to the flying and we'll be with you again shortly. Now would be a good time to open up your iPad, and you'll soon be able to track our position on the real-time map that we'll be displaying there for you. Okay, it's the flight deck here. Just to let you know, we have been descending for some time now. We're going to be going down to about 500 feet in order to fly through the Musket Gap, and for the first part of the flight we'll be flying over the Rot Inlet. So we'll get down quite low. You'll be able to get some good views from a low altitude, and then we're going to start climbing up so that we can get up to the altitude of the peaks. And as we look through forward now, we can see the inlet which leads into the Musket Gap. So we'll be making that turn within the next couple of minutes. Okay, we're just about to begin our turn now into the Musket Gap. So you'll start to see as we make that turn right across the Rot Inlet towards Mount Elliot on the far side. And on our right now are the Dolan, Creek Track, and other peaks in the area that we'll be visiting shortly. And there we go, we now have a clear view across the inlet with Elliot Peak, the dominant mountain, on the far side. Well, I do just have to comment on this. The weather this evening is absolutely phenomenal. We are just so lucky to have these conditions this evening. Absolutely perfect. And now as we make our next turn to the left, you'll get a good view of the Dinsmore and Bombardier Glacier, which join the Edgeworth Glacier and spill together into the Rot Inlet. Now we're starting the broad right-hand turn. It's going to allow us to gain about 3,000 feet in altitude, which is where we'll need to be as we approach the peaks that are ahead of us, which do, of course, now right in the center of the screen, show the two Nodwell Peaks. And of course we'll get a closer look at them in just a few moments. As we swing around to the right, this is the Ferguson Range that's coming into view, and then behind that is the Skidoo Nunatak. So now as we head back over the inlet, we're getting a fantastic view of the never setting sun. And at this point we're going to be leveling off and starting our run in towards the other side of the valley. So we have now completed the turn that we needed to make in order to gain altitude, and are going to be heading straight for the first peak. Now as we get closer, we're going to be taking a really careful look at the ridge along the skyline, because that's more or less the path that we're going to be landing on when we come in from the east. And although there hasn't been much wind to our knowledge in the last couple of days, we don't want to take any chances. When we were there previously in the helicopter, it was firm, hard snow, but it's quite possible that a sudden storm could have blown some of that away and left a whole field of rocks. So we, as I say, we're going to take a really careful look at that slope before we make a commitment to head in there and land. So now we're just going to sneak around in the back between Peak 2 and Dolan and just take one more look at the landing zone from the other side, after which we'll make another right-hand turn in order to set ourselves up for our final approach. So based on what we have just seen, we are satisfied that the landing area is still safe, and we are now going to prepare the aircraft for landing. So if everybody will please ensure that your seatbelts are well fastened. Be aware that the touchdown may be a little bit firmer than you are used to, but I think we'll come out fine on the other side. We've now just turned onto the downwind leg, and there's actually really no wind to speak of. So once we have landed, we expect it will be quite mild outside, currently showing minus 12 Celsius. So we've just made our final turn as part of our approach. We'll be back with you once we're on the ground. Five, four, three, two, one, touchdown. Well, what do you say? It was a good thing we had the brakes checked before we left. Anyway, we have arrived. We will open the doors in a moment or two so that you can get out and take some photographs and take a little wander around. Please do not go forward of the aircraft though. It is very steep and likely to be slippery. So any photography, please do after the aircraft, and please be ready to come back on board in 15 minutes. Okay, well, we do have everybody now back on board and the doors closed. We will go through our startup and departure procedures immediately, and then be heading on our way to Rothera. Once we are in our climbing state, We'll get back to you with one more announcement concerning this evening's flight. But for now, please just make sure your seatbelts are fastened. Again, there may be a couple of bumps on the takeoff, which would be something that you may not be accustomed to. We'll be back with you in about 5 minutes. So our last special announcement is to let you know that on your tablet devices in the seat pockets in front of you, we have now activated yet another application, and this is a slideshow of photographs within the Antarctic Peninsula. We hope you enjoy that, and we will then be back with you one more time as we start our final approach into Rothera. Our flying time from here will be about another hour and 45 minutes, and we're going to continue our climb now to about 8,000 feet. Enjoy the flight. Good evening, everybody. Once again, we hope you have enjoyed your flight this evening. If you take a look out the window, you will see that we are just about to begin our final approach into Rothera. Please ensure that your seatbelt is fastened, and we'll be back to you again once we're on the ground. As luck would have it, if you take a look out the window now, you will see the German polar research vessel, the Polar Stern, is just crossing our flight path. One final piece of excitement, there is now an iceberg partially blocking our approach. Please hang on as we make our way around it. Okay, we are just awaiting parking instructions, and we have to go immediately here on the left. As this is now the termination of our flight, we would like to thank you very much for joining us this evening. We trust you all enjoyed the experience tonight. We hope that we will have the opportunity to fly with you again in the future. And with that, Todsits, Ufambi Zakanaka, and good night.